Hello students, today we are going to study about barriers to communication. Let's first see what actually a communication is. Communication is a multi-dimensional interactive process of sharing sets of signs, symbols and language from one person to another person so that a suitable response results. As you can see from the image itself that the two people they are sitting and they are exchanging information. So a kind of a communication is taking place between these two people. This is a communication cycle. In common, the process is started by the sender. Sender encodes the message, then is sent through a channel, received by a receiver. Receiver decode the message, and the receiver he gives a response to the sender through a feedback. So it, basically the feedback is a very important aspect in the communication cycle, because through the feedback only the sender comes to know that the message encoded by him is properly decoded or not. There are certain essentials of effective communication. That was first thing is we need a communication environment. A well defined setup like a classroom is example for this. Then there should be a cooperation between the sender and the receiver. Selection of an appropriate channel is a very important requirement to make your communication effective. Correct encoding and decoding of the message is required. Then there should be a proper receipt of desired response and feedback. Now let's move towards the barriers to effective communication. We in the previous slide we studied how you can make your communication effective and what are the essentials of that. But whenever a communication takes place, somehow there may be chances of some hindrances or barriers. So barrier is basically an unplanned and undesired interference in the communication process that obstructs the smooth flow of message from the sender to the receiver and is known as a noise. So noise is basically any kind of a disturbance which is taking place in the process of communication. Barriers to effective communication, if we have to classify it, we can classify it on the basis of three. That is your interpersonal barrier, organizational barrier. We have studied that the communication takes place at various levels that we have studied in the previous sessions also. When we talk about intrapersonal, it means when there is a communication among the person itself. When a thought process is going into a person itself, then it becomes your intrapersonal communication. And when when a noise is created in that process, then it is your intrapersonal barrier. Interpersonal is when there is a communication taking place between two or more people in proximity, then it is your interpersonal barrier, the interpersonal communication. And when the barrier occurs in that particular process, then it is interpersonal barrier. Same way, when the communication takes place in an organization or outside the organization for official purpose, and it is your organizational communication. But there are certain reasons that may hinder the process of smooth functioning of an organization, then it is your organizational barrier. So let's see intrapersonal barrier. What are the reasons behind this barrier? So the first one is your wrong assumption, varied perception, impervious categories, and categorical thinking. These are the certain reasons which leads to intrapersonal barrier. Next is your interpersonal barrier. So interpersonal, you have, there could be again many reasons. The first one is your restricted vocabulary, incompatibility of verbal and non-verbal messages, emotional outburst, cultural variation, poor listening skills. In organizational barrier, there are again numerous reasons. The first one is the numerous transfer station, fear of superiors, negative tendencies, and information overload. Let's study in detail. So let's study about intrapersonal barrier. There are many reasons behind it. Wrong assumption, varied perception. Let's see about the wrong assumption first. When see many barriers stems from wrong assumption. Wrong assumptions are generally made because the sender or the receiver doesn't have adequate knowledge about each other's background or entertains certain false notions which are fixed in their minds. Let's try to understand this with an example. For example, there is a doctor and a patient, and the doctor, while writing something on a prescription, he writes SOS without knowing whether the patient understands the term SOS. He is creating a barrier in their communication. So, here the doctor has made a wrong assumption about his patient's level of knowledge. Next is your varied perception. Now, varied perception is we know the story of the six blind man and the description of an elephant. From the image itself, you can see that these blind people they are actually trying to perceive the different parts of an elephant. One of them touches the trunk of an elephant and he perceives it's a snake. Same way, when touches the leg of an elephant, one of them perceives it's a tree. Body is like a wall, the tail is like a rope, and even the ears of an elephant is like a fan. None of them is incorrect, as the part of the elephant body touched by each man was compared with various objects. This is how an individual perceives reality. You can try to understand this with another example. If there is a glass and we have a water in this glass, many people they may say that the glass is half empty, and the other group of people they may say it's half full. Both are correct, but the way they are perceiving the things are different. Half empty means they have a negative tendency, they are pessimistic people. Half full means they are having a positive approach and they are the optimistic people. So varied people they have a varied perception. The best way to overcome this barrier is to step back and take a wider perspective of the issue. Next is your impervious categories. Impervious categories in general, it happens when we react positively to information only if it is in consonance with our own views and attitudes. Conversely, when we receive information that does not conform to our personal views, habits, and attitudes or appears unfavorable to us, we tend to react negatively or even disbelieve it. Such people fall into previous categories because they may not be able to accept any deviation from others from their main point of view. Next is the categorical thinking. Categorical thinking, when the people who feel that they know it all, they are also known as pansophists. Pansophists are the people who feel that they know each and everything. These are the pansophists. So this type of thinking exists in people who feel that they know everything about a particular subject and therefore refuse to accept any further information uh, on your any topic. For example, like you have to attend any meeting and you have already briefed about the particular meeting, and when you sit in the meeting you have this inclination in your mind that you know each and everything, and suddenly when the meeting gets over and you try to propose any particular thing which has already been discussed, it shows that you are not listening or you are not present, you are mentally not present at that meeting. So it may create a kind of a barrier and it may be a cause of a kind of an embarrassment also. Next is your interpersonal barrier. Interpersonal barrier is when two people or more than two people they are interacting, and in divine they are interacting, a problem arises, a kind of a noise is created, then it is your barrier. So there could be many reasons behind it. The first one is your restricted vocabulary. Restricted vocabulary means inadequate words, or an inadequate vocabulary can be a major hindrance in communication. At times, your pen falters or your tongue fumbles as you search for the exact word or a phrase. Then, the next reason for interpersonal barrier is incompatibility, or you can say the mismatch mismatch of your verbal and non-verbal messages. Uh, just imagine a situation where your CEO introduces the newly recruited middle level manager to the other employees. In a small speech, he conveys the message that he is very delighted to have the new manager appointed in his office. However, the expression on his face shows just the opposite of what he is saying. The stark difference between the verbal and non-verbal aspects of this communication leaves his listeners feeling confused and puzzled. So we need to be very careful while giving any kind of a non-verbal cues while conveying any message. There should be a proper match between verbals and non-verbal messages. Next is emotional outburst. Excessive emotional involvement can be an obstacle in communication. In that particular situation, messages can either misinterpreted, ignored, or overreacted to by many people displaying such behavior. Imagine that you are the president of a well-established company. There are rumors floating amongst your employees that you have indulged in fraudulent activities. You're fully aware that these rumors are baseless. However, when you are asked to address the same employees, you are unable to put your point across as you are flushed with anger. Despite the fact that you are a confident public speaker, your communication failed as you are overwhelmed by your emotions. So it's always advisable that not to communicate when you are emotionally charged or imbalanced. Next is your cultural variation. This is one of the predominant factors in communication failure as businesses are increasing across national boundaries to compete on a global scale. The outlook of global and domestic workforce has changed drastically. The management and employees of such companies need to closely observe the laws, customs, and business practices of their host countries while dealing with their multinational workforce. The next reason is your poor listening skills. As a very common obstacle to communication is poor listening habits. We should remember that listening and hearing are not the same. Hearing is a passive exercise, while listening requires a careful attention and accurate decoding of signals received from the speaker. Misunderstanding and conflicts can be mitigated if people listen to the message with attention. Next is your organizational barrier, and there are many reasons behind the organizational barrier, like numerous transfer stations, fear of superiors, inappropriate media, negative tendencies, and information overload. Let me explain you all these one by one. The first one is your numerous transfer station. A numerous transfer station is basically the more links there are in communication chain, the greater are the chances of communication that will occur. So we need to minimize the number of transfer stations. Having too many transfer stations is always deterrent to effective communication and should be avoided. Transfer stations do serve a purpose, but having too many of them is counterproductive. Next is your fear of superiors. In a rigidly structured organization, fear or awe of the superior prevents subordinates from speaking frankly. An employee may not be pleased with the way his boss works but is unable to put his points across because of losing his boss' goodwill. When and in that particular situation, you are suppressed and you are not able to give your output. Next is inappropriate media. While choosing the medium, you should keep in mind the advantages, disadvantages, and potential barriers to communication. So, before sending a message, you need to consider the following factors. Like the first thing is how much time it will take to send the message. The second thing is how much cost will take in sending a message. Third is what kind of a message you are sending, whether it is your confidential message, personal message, or a general message. And the next thing that you have to keep in mind is your intended audience. What kind of an audience or what kind of a person to whom you are sending that particular message. So you have, before selecting any medium, you need to keep these 4 points in your mind. For instance, like the telephone would not be an ideal medium for conveying confidential information. Such messages are best conveyed in person, or if the receiver is located in another office, then you can send that particular information by speed post. Next is your negative tendencies. Negative tendencies, like whenever in an organization we work, the organizations generally create a work groups, and in those work groups, if the one group is supported by the boss, in that case again a negative tendency occurs between those two groups. Next is your information overload. In information overload, it's generally one of the major problems faced by the organization due to the availability of huge amounts of data which the receiver is unable to handle effectively. To reduce information overload in an organization, screening of information is mandatory. Messages should be directed only to those people who are likely to benefit from the information. If you have to send an email to a particular person, you are supposed to send it to the person instead of sending it to all. So that reduces the information overload, because nobody has a time to decipher the meaning and to read your decipher the meaning of your emails and to read your emails if they are not related to the work. Next is like how you have to improve your communication, how you can overcome the barriers. The first thing is you have to create an open communication environment, and you have to always keep your receiver in mind and avoid having too many transfer stations. If you keep the receiver in mind, you will direct the message which is required by the receiver, and not you will not direct the message which is not required. Do not communicate when you are emotionally disturbed. If you are emotionally disturbed, rest for a while, take your time, and try to communicate afterwards when you feel that now you are settled and you are not filled with any kind of grievances to with the listeners you are talking to. Be aware of diversity in culture, languages, and etc. Because in a globalized world, we need to communicate with people of different cultures, and we should be aware of other cultures and the languages. Use appropriate non-verbal cues. There should be a proper match between verbal and non-verbal cues. Always select the most suitable medium for the communication process, and then always analyze the feedback, because feedback is the only source to ensure that whatever you are sending to the person is properly received by the receiver and is received in the same way you are expecting the listener to receive it. I hope you all like the sessions. Thank you. Happy learning.